Military doctrine across 17 civilized sectors maintained one fundamental truth. You do not enter active combat zones without adequate armor, weaponry, and approximately 6 layers of authorization from increasingly nervous commanding officers. This principle had been established over 3,000 years of According to YouTube analytics, 98% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. Stellar warfare, refined through countless tactical simulations, and violated exactly once every time a human got involved. The Convergence War had been grinding along the contested moons of Theta 7 for approximately 8 standard months, which meant everyone was tired, cranky, and running low on the good ration packs, the ones with actual flavor. The coalition forces, a delightful mixture of species who normally couldn't agree on which direction constituted up in zero gravity, had somehow managed to coordinate long enough to push back the Krelll invasion force. The Krelll, for context, were what happened when evolution decided that 8-foot-tall murder lizards needed better PR and opposable thumbs. Command Center Beta 3 hummed with the usual symphony of warfare. Tactical displays flickering, communications officers shouting coordinates that nobody could hear, and that one persistent coffee maker that gurgled ominously in the corner like it was plotting revolution. The observation deck overlooked the valley, where the current skirmish was turning the landscape into something that resembled abstract art, if abstract art involved significantly more explosions. Commander Vexith, a Qualian whose species prided themselves on logical thinking and emotional stability, was having what humans called a very bad day. His sensory stalks twitched with the particular rhythm that indicated his blood pressure was doing interesting things. Across 3 monitors, he watched the battlefield unfold with the grim acceptance of someone who knew the casualty reports would require extra forms. The human medic had been assigned to the secondary medical station, a fortified bunker approximately 2 kilometers behind the front line. This distance was calculated by military strategists who understood that medics, unlike ammunition, could not be easily replaced by supply drops. She had been there for exactly 4 hours before someone noticed she was not, in fact, there anymore. Lieutenant Krastok, whose species had perfected the art of pessimism through 6,000 years of disappointment, spotted the problem first. His 4 eyes widened in an expression that eloquently communicated, "Oh no," not again without requiring actual words. The human was running, not away from the combat zone, which would have been sensible, expected, and entirely in line with self-preservation instincts that most species considered essential to continued existence. No, she was running toward the artillery exchange, through the smoke and plasma fire, carrying nothing more defensive than a medical kit, and apparently every ounce of audacity the human species could manufacture. Vexith's translator struggled to process his own thoughts into coherent speech. The device finally settled on a string of words that roughly translated to questioning the human's parentage, sanity, and basic understanding of ballistics. Communications lit up like a festival display. Every squad leader within visual range immediately began asking the same question through increasingly frantic channels. Was this a new human tactic they had not been briefed on? Was running directly into enemy fire some kind of psychological warfare? Had someone forgotten to mention that humans were experimenting with immortality technology? The answer to all these questions was no, but nobody had time to explain that before the human disappeared into a crater approximately 40 meters from the Krelll forward position. Now the Krelll were exceptional warriors. They had evolved on a death world where the plants were carnivorous and the weather held personal grudges. Their military training began before they could properly walk, and their tactical thinking was sharp enough to cut through starship hulls. What they were not prepared for was a 5'6" human medic dropping into their contested territory, wearing scrubs and an expression that suggested she was running late for an appointment. The forward observation post went silent in the way that suggested everyone was holding their breath and possibly composing final messages to their families. Plasma fire continued its light show above the crater. Artillery shells whistled through the air with the cheerful trajectory of objects that did not care about personal survival. The human had been out of sight for approximately 30 seconds, which was 29 seconds longer than anyone expected her to survive. Then she emerged. Not quickly, because speed would have implied some sense of urgency about the multiple weapon systems actively trying to convert her into component atoms. She climbed out of that crater with the measured pace of someone navigating a grocery store, not a battlefield. Her medical kit hung from one shoulder, somehow still intact despite the local environment's best efforts, and tucked under each arm, wrapped in what appeared to be emergency thermal blankets, were 2 Krelll juveniles. The firing stopped, not through any tactical decision or coordinated ceasefire, but because every single combatant on both sides was attempting to process what their visual sensors were reporting. Krelll did not have juveniles on battlefields. Krelll juveniles remained in protected nurseries under guard by elite warriors who took their duty with religious seriousness. The presence of Krelll young in an active war zone made approximately as much sense as discovering fish operating heavy machinery. The human walked back across no man's land like she was crossing a park. Artillery fire resumed around her, but seemed to politely miss by margins that probability suggested should not exist. A plasma bolt scorched the ground, 2 meters to her left. She adjusted course slightly, the way one might avoid a puddle, and continued her leisurely stroll toward coalition lines. Commander Vexith's sensory stalks had stopped twitching and gone completely rigid, which his medical training recognized as a sign of impending system shock. His vocalization organ produced a sound that the translator gave up trying to interpret, settling for displaying a series of symbols that roughly conveyed existential confusion. The human reached the coalition defensive perimeter. She did not dive for cover. She did not sprint the final meters. She walked up to the barrier, turned to look back at the battlefield with the expression of someone evaluating their life choices, then carefully climbed over while balancing 2 completely calm Krelll juveniles who were making soft chirping sounds that their species normally reserved for nursing periods. Lieutenant Krastok managed to form words, though they came out with the hollow tone of someone whose worldview was actively crumbling. He asked the question that 17 species were simultaneously wondering through their respective communication channels. What in the name of every deity, dark force, and random cosmic probability was she thinking? The human, still cradling 2 members of the enemy species who should have been either hiding or attempting to bite through her protective gear, looked up at the observation deck. Through the zoom display, Vexith could see her face clearly. She was not smiling. She was not proud. She wore the expression of someone who had encountered a problem, solved it, and was now mildly annoyed that everyone was making such a fuss about basic decency. The medical bay received her transmission before she even reached the entrance. She needed warm blankets, hydration solutions suitable for Krelll physiology, and someone to stop asking stupid questions long enough to help her stabilize 2 juveniles who were suffering from exposure, dehydration, and the general trauma of being abandoned in a war zone. Behind her, on the battlefield, the Krelll forces had stopped advancing. Their communication channels buzzed with activity that coalition intelligence would spend the next 3 days attempting to decode. The artillery fell silent. The plasma exchanges ceased. An entire military operation had ground to halt because one human decided that enemy combatants or not, children did not belong in craters. The Krelll battle network experienced something it had never encountered in 4 centuries of continuous warfare. Complete consensus without debate. Every warrior from the front line to the command carrier orbiting above received the same biometric data simultaneously. 2 juvenile life signatures, previously listed as missing and presumed casualties of the orbital bombardment 3 days prior, had just appeared on scanners inside coalition territory. Alive. War Commander Krelll, whose decorated carapace bore the scars of 63 major engagements, stood motionless in his command chamber. His tactical display showed information that contradicted everything his species understood about enemy behavior. The coalition forces had not taken hostages. They had not broadcast demands. A single individual had simply walked into contested ground and extracted the juveniles like she was collecting misplaced luggage. His second-in-command, a veteran whose name translated roughly to "he who calculates death," ventured a question using the careful tone of someone who suspected reality had taken a vacation. Had the coalition somehow trained their medics in advanced infiltration techniques? Was this a new form of psychological operation designed to create confusion in Krelll command structure? Krell's mandibles clicked in the negative. He had fought humans before, on 3 separate occasions that his military strategists still referenced with the bewildered tone usually reserved for natural disasters. This was not strategy. This was not tactics. This was a human seeing something unacceptable and deciding that minor details like active combat and basic survival instincts were negotiable obstacles. The forward scout who had been closest to the crater when the human arrived provided his report with the shell-shocked delivery of someone reconsidering career choices. She had appeared through the smoke without warning, dropped into the depression, and spent approximately 10 seconds assessing the juveniles before wrapping them in thermal coverings. She had not drawn a weapon. She had not even looked at the Krelll warriors positioned 15 meters away, who were themselves frozen in confusion about whether shooting a medic retrieving young violated some warfare protocol nobody had properly documented. One warrior had attempted to approach, not to attack. The scout was very clear about this distinction, but to understand what was happening. The human had looked up, made direct eye contact, and said something in her species language that the translator refused to process beyond categorizing it as a significant threat, despite the complete absence of actual hostile indicators. The warrior had stopped moving. Self-preservation instincts, it turned out, functioned across species barriers when a human was involved. Back in Coalition Medical, the situation was developing into what medical professionals called organized chaos and what everyone else called barely controlled panic. The head physician, a Krellian whose species had perfected medicine through their unfortunate tendency to accidentally poison themselves with their own cuisine, stared at the 2 Krelll juveniles with the expression of someone whose training had not covered this scenario. Krelll physiology was documented. Medical science understood their biological requirements. What was not documented was how to explain to High Command that the medical bay was currently housing 2 members of the enemy species who were chirping contentedly, while being fed specialized nutrient solutions by a human medic who had violated approximately 16 military regulations in the past 20 minutes. The juveniles, for their part, seemed remarkably unconcerned about being surrounded by species their elders were actively trying to eliminate. The smaller one, barely the size of a human torso, had wrapped its tail around the medic's arm and refused to release. The larger one kept making a throaty rumble that Krelll behavioral studies identified as a comfort-seeking sound, typically directed at parental figures. Security officers arrived with weapons drawn and uncertainty written across whatever features their species used for facial expressions. The ranking officer, whose tactical training covered hostage situations, prisoner management, and proper documentation procedures, found himself in a scenario that resembled none of these. He asked the obvious question: were these juveniles prisoners of war? The human medic, who had not bothered to remove her blood-stained scrubs or address the plasma burn on her shoulder, delivered a response that would be quoted in military academies for decades. She explained with the patience of someone addressing particularly slow students that these were children, not combatants, not prisoners, not tactical assets. Children who had been scared, alone, and abandoned in a war zone created by adults who should have known better. She then suggested, with phrasing that made several officers reconsider their life choices, that anyone who wanted to debate the finer points of military law could do so after these juveniles were stable, warm, and no longer showing signs of shock. The security officer wisely decided that arguing with a human who had just performed the galaxy's most audacious rescue operation was above his pay grade. He stationed guards outside the medical bay, filed a report that he knew would cause administrative nightmares, and quietly wondered if hazard pay covered existential confusion. On the Krelll command carrier, Krelll made a decision that would have his superiors questioning his judgment for months. He opened a direct communication channel to Coalition Command. This was not unprecedented. Temporary truces for prisoner exchanges occurred occasionally when both sides needed to demonstrate they followed some version of civilized warfare. What was unprecedented was his opening statement. He did not demand. He did not threaten. He simply stated that the Krelll Dominion wished to discuss the status of 2 juveniles currently in Coalition custody, and that he was prepared to offer considerations in exchange for their safe return. Commander Vexith received this transmission while simultaneously processing 17 other crisis reports and seriously contemplating retirement to a planet where humans were not stationed. His translator worked overtime rendering Krell's formal military language into something comprehensible. The Krelll commander was proposing a temporary ceasefire, a complete halt to all hostile actions in this sector, in exchange for 2 juveniles who, by all military logic, should never have been in the combat zone to begin with. The human medic had accidentally created a diplomatic incident by being decent. Vexith's sensory stalks performed movements that his species reserved for moments of profound revelation, mixed with intense frustration. He approved the ceasefire, authorized the medical bay to continue treatment, and added a note to his personal log that humans were apparently capable of accomplishing through sheer stubborn compassion what tactical divisions could not achieve through coordinated military operations. The medical bay settled into an odd rhythm. The juveniles, named in reports only by identification numbers, because nobody wanted to get attached to enemy combatants, even if they were barely old enough to have proper names, responded well to treatment. The smaller one developed an attachment to the human medic that behavioral specialists noted was identical to imprinting behavior. The larger one, showing early signs of the intelligence that made adult Krelll such formidable opponents, seemed to understand on some level that it had been rescued. Coalition intelligence officers arrived to assess the situation. They brought scanning equipment, behavioral analysis tools, and enough legal documentation to supply a small library. They were prepared for hostility, aggression, or at minimum, some indication that these juveniles represented a security threat. What they found was the smaller juvenile sleeping in a heated recovery pod, while the larger one watched with protective intensity as medical staff monitored vital signs. The human sat between them, reviewing charts and occasionally reaching out to provide physical comfort that every xenobiologist in the room knew was significant for Krelll development. The lead intelligence officer, a pragmatic individual who had survived this long by expecting the worst and being pleasantly surprised when it was only terrible, asked the question that everyone was thinking. What happened if the juveniles could not be returned? What if this ceasefire was temporary and combat resumed with 2 enemy young under coalition protection? The human medic looked up from her charts. Her expression was not defiant or aggressive. It was simply certain. She would continue providing care regardless of political complications, and anyone who suggested otherwise could personally explain to these juveniles why adult conflicts mattered more than their survival. The intelligence officer nodded slowly, made a note in his report that would probably get flagged by multiple review boards, and decided that some situations were above his classification level. Outside, across the contested valley, Krelll and coalition forces maintained their positions, but held their fire. Artillery pieces remained loaded but silent. Patrol units monitored each other from distance, but initiated no engagements. The war had not ended, but it had paused, suspended in the strange gravity well created by one human's refusal to accept that some lives were acceptable casualties. 72 hours into the accidental ceasefire, Coalition High Command arrived in person, which was never a positive sign. Fleet Admiral Krelll, whose species communicated primarily through bioluminescent patterns, was currently displaying colors that roughly translated to profound administrative annoyance mixed with reluctant curiosity. The briefing room had been cleared of everyone except essential personnel, which apparently included the human medic, despite her complete lack of military rank beyond the medical designation that technically made her a non-combatant. She sat in a chair designed for species with different skeletal structures, looking mildly uncomfortable and significantly unbothered by the collection of high-ranking officers studying her like she was a particularly confusing specimen. Admiral Krell's translator worked through the opening question, which had been carefully prepared by 6 different diplomatic advisors and still managed to sound accusatory. What, precisely, had she been thinking when she violated direct orders, abandoned her assigned post, and extracted enemy juveniles from an active combat zone? The medic's response was refreshingly direct. She had been thinking that leaving children to die in a crater was unacceptable regardless of their species, military affiliation, or the political complications their rescue might create. She delivered this statement with the calm certainty of someone who had done the moral calculus and found the equation remarkably simple. A Qualian tactical officer attempted to explain the complexities of warfare, the established protocols for combat zones, and the very sensible reasons why medical personnel remained behind defensive lines. The medic listened with the polite attention of someone waiting for the irrelevant lecture to conclude, then pointed out that protocols became significantly less important when actual lives were involved. The xenopsychology officer, a professional whose entire career focused on understanding cross-species behavior, asked the question that had been circulating through academic channels since news of the incident spread. Did she understand that Krelll juveniles, even at that developmental stage, possessed the predatory instincts that made adult Krelll such dangerous opponents? Had she considered the physical risk of handling young from a species evolved for combat? The medic's expression suggested she was reconsidering her opinion of educated professionals. She noted, with patience that was clearly wearing thin, that scared children were scared children regardless of how many teeth they possessed or what their species did for warfare. The smaller juvenile had been hypothermic and dehydrated. The larger one had a fractured foreleg that needed immediate stabilization. These were medical facts that superseded theoretical discussions about predatory behavior. Commander Vexith, who had been quietly observing from the corner while his sensory stalks performed unauthorized stress responses, asked a different question. How had she known the juveniles were there? This produced a moment of silence. The medic admitted she had not known. She had seen the crater, recognized it as potential shelter, and went to check for survivors. Finding Krelll young instead of coalition soldiers had been surprising, but had not changed the fundamental situation. Someone needed help. She had the training to provide it, so she did. The simplicity of this explanation seemed to cause physical discomfort among the assembled officers. Military operations did not function on such straightforward moral reasoning. Tactical decisions required assessment of risk versus benefit, consideration of strategic implications, and approximately 17 levels of authorization before anyone did anything that might affect diplomatic relations. Humans apparently operated on different algorithms. The intelligence briefing that followed covered everything coalition analysts had learned about Krelll social structures, juvenile development, and the significance of parental bonds in their culture. Removing young from danger was not merely appreciated in Krelll society, it was considered a sacred obligation that superseded even warfare. The human medic had, entirely by accident, performed an act that Krelll cultural values considered the highest form of honor. Admiral Corzen's bioluminescence shifted to colors that indicated grudging respect mixed with continued confusion. The ceasefire was holding specifically because the Krelll commander had personally guaranteed it while negotiations continued. Krelll wanted his juveniles returned safely, but he also wanted to meet the individual who had risked everything to retrieve them. The medic absorbed this information without visible reaction. She asked the only question that mattered to her. When could the juveniles go home? Diplomatic officers explained the complications. Treaties needed drafting. Exchange protocols required establishment. Both sides needed assurances that this would not set precedents for future conflicts. The process could take weeks. The human medic stood up, thanked everyone for their time with politeness that somehow felt like a dismissal, and explained she had patients to check on. 2 patients who were probably wondering where she was. She walked out of the briefing room, leaving behind a collection of high-ranking military officials who were simultaneously impressed, frustrated, and completely uncertain how to document any of this in official reports. Lieutenant Krasitok, watching from his station, updated his personal assessment of human behavior. His previous conclusion that humans were unpredictable remained accurate. He added a new note. They were also apparently immune to proper military authority when they decided morality outranked protocol. The exchange happened on neutral ground, a cleared section of valley where both sides could maintain visual contact without feeling tactically vulnerable. Diplomatic teams had spent 2 weeks arranging what amounted to a very expensive handoff that could have been completed in 10 minutes if everyone involved possessed less paranoia and fewer lawyers. Krelll arrived personally, accompanied by an honor guard that maintained respectful distance. He approached slowly, displaying none of the aggressive posturing that Krelll warriors typically used. The human medic waited with both juveniles, who had made remarkable recoveries and were now energetically attempting to climb her legs while making sounds that xenobiologists were frantically recording for future study. The Krelll commander stopped 3 meters away. His translator processed his words carefully, rendering them into coalition standard with unusual precision. He thanked her, not with the formal military courtesy that protocol demanded, but with genuine gratitude that transcended species barriers. She had protected his nephew and his second cousin's offspring, when every tactical consideration suggested abandoning them would have been safer. The medic's response was characteristically brief. She told him they were good kids, handed over detailed medical records, and suggested follow-up appointments that made several observers wonder if she understood these were supposed to be enemy combatants. The juveniles, displaying emotional intelligence that their species was not supposed to develop until much later, seemed reluctant to leave. The smaller one made distressed sounds until the medic knelt down and explained something in quiet tones that the translators could not quite capture. Whatever she said worked. Both juveniles transferred to Krell's care, though they kept looking back. The war resumed 3 days later, because political tensions and resource disputes do not vanish simply because someone demonstrated basic decency. However, something fundamental had shifted. Medical personnel on both sides became implicitly protected. Evacuation corridors appeared during heavy fighting. Casualty retrieval operations proceeded without interference, regardless of which side was collecting their wounded. Commander Vexith documented these changes in reports that his superiors read with visible confusion. Humanitarian consideration had somehow infiltrated military operations, introduced by one human who refused to accept that warfare required abandoning compassion. The medic returned to her duties, treating wounded without regard for species or allegiance, maintaining the same stubborn morality that had caused such administrative chaos. Military analysts added her actions to the growing file of human behavior that defied logical prediction. Because humans, it turned out, had this inconvenient habit of treating the impossible as merely another problem requiring practical solutions. They looked at established rules, recognized when those rules produced unacceptable outcomes, and simply decided to operate according to different principles, which was either the most dangerous or most valuable quality a species could possess, depending entirely on which side of the battlefield you were standing.